So the seeming stereotype of the Starks in A Song of Ice and Fire is that they are an honorable lot, seemingly to a fault. Ned shows mercy to Cersei, bringing about his downfall. Robb feels it necessary to marry Jane Westerling to be honorable, to his downfall. Jon wants to save the wildlings, to his downfall. But what if I told you this wasn't always the case? That at a different point in history, the Starks, and the whole North and Vale as well, were conniving worms, lying, promising, waiting, yet never delivering. Because that's what House Stark was during the Dance of the Dragons. And again, the rest of the North and Vale were as well. Despite making agreements like the grandly named Pact of Ice and Fire, they never honored them. And due to their actions and inactions, Rhaenyra and her family perished. Now, to truly understand their treachery in full, we have to go over nearly all of the Dance of the Dragons. I hope you like timelines. So, jumping into it, the Dance of the Dragons begins when Viserys I dies, and we are specifically given his death date, the third day of the third moon of 129 AC. In Westeros, they don't have named months, but we're going to call it March 3rd. So that's the beginning of our timeline. March 3rd, 129, Viserys dies. And if Viserys dies on 3/3, this means that the Green Council convenes that night and the next morning of March 4th, where they conspire to crown Aegon. The rest of March 4th is spent finding Aegon, securing the City Watch, and seizing the royal treasury. Then, 2 days pass, where ravens are sent to Old Town, Casterly Rock, Riverrun, and Highgarden. March 5th and 6th are specifically Raven Days. Then it's not until March 7th that the Green Council breaks out the Annals of the Great Council of 101 to see who their enemies might be, and they decide to send Aemond to Storm's End to bring over the Baratheons. Then finally, we are told that on March 10th, 129, the bells are rung and the kingdom is told that Viserys is dead. They literally let his body rot for a week. And so our first events are rather clear. In that first week after Viserys dies, there is the Green Council, ravens are sent off, and Aemond is sent to Storm's End. And then the bells are rung. And after this, there is a hasty coronation for Aegon, which probably happens on March 11th. Now we know that Rhaenyra, after hearing of her father's death, goes into premature labor, and so it's not until the next day that she has her Black Council. So that's likely March 12th. And we know that she has a hasty coronation the day after, which is March 13th. And we know that Aegon's coronation and Rhaenyra's coronation happen within a couple days of each other, because Steffan Darkland leaves King's Landing the day before Aegon's coronation and arrives just before Rhaenyra's coronation. And so the events of the first 10 days are pretty firm. After the bells are rung on the 10th, we have Aegon's coronation on the 11th, the Black Council on the 12th, and Rhaenyra's coronation on the 13th. And so the next day, back in King's Landing, people hear about Rhaenyra's coronation. That is March 14th. And Grand Maester Orwyle is to be sent to Rhaenyra with terms. Now we don't know when exactly he left, probably that day or the next. And it seems Steffan Darkland took 3 days to get to Dragonstone, so it may be that Orwyle didn't get to Rhaenyra until the 18th of March, and returned back to King's Landing on the 21st. After the failed reconciliation, we know that Driftmark ships cut off the gullet, which happens probably as Orwyle was returning. Now perhaps you can push things a day here or there, or a week here or there, but in the end we find that all of the initial events happen in March. The war begins, in earnest, in March. We are then told of 3 simultaneous trips on Dragonback by Jace, Luke, and Daemon. Now the exact timing of this is unknown. We are told soon after the closing of the gullet, but we know the trips have to take place within about 2 months after Rhaenyra's coronation. And we know this because Rhaenyra is specifically not participating in the trip because she's still recovering from childbirth, which takes usually 6 to 8 weeks. She had her stillbirth the day she received news of her father's death, probably on March 11th. Also, Jace is said to be back from his trip half a year before his birthday, which is at the end of the year. Also, Aemond is at Storm's End the entire time, being entertained through feasts, jousts, and hunts. There's really only so long the guy would do that. And there's only so long the guy could do that without the Blacks finding out. Not to mention, time is of the essence. Aemond was sent out within days of hearing of the king's death. One would think the Black faction is just as rushed. In fact, the entire reason that Jace and Luke went, according to Jace, is that the dragons will win the lords over quicker than ravens. He wants fast action from these lords, which happen to be the lords of the Vale in the north. The point being, it makes the most sense that Luke goes to Storm's End, and eventually dies, at the end of March. However, one could possibly push this event into April. May would probably be too much, as by then Rhaenyra would be almost recovered, Aemond would have been feasting and jousting for months, and diplomatically, the Blacks would have been acting way late. And this is important as Luke's trip is simultaneous with Jace's trip and Daemon's trip. This means that Jace secures the Vale and the North, and Daemon takes Harrenhal closer to the beginning of the year. And that is probably March or possibly April. Now it's worth going into what Jace promised and what he actually got in return and when. Jace went to the Eyrie, where Jane Arryn wanted dragon riders to defend her. So Jace promises that. Then he goes to White Harbor, where Desmond Manderly wants a marriage. So he promises Joffrey to Manderly's daughter when the war is over. And then he goes to Winterfell, where he promises his future daughter will marry Cregan Stark's infant son, again, after the war is over. And this is all well and good, except none of these forces materialize for a year. Now it's uncertain whether Jane Arryn was expecting dragon riders first, but Manderly and Stark have no excuse. What they want can only be achieved after the war, if the Blacks win. And so we have to ask, where the hell are these forces? A lot of time goes by in the year 129, as we shall see. Now, the rest of 129 doesn't give us too many specifics on when these events occur, but we can perhaps figure a few things out. After the 3 flights of Jace, Luke, and Daemon, we have the Blood and Cheese incident, but that doesn't give us any clues on the passage of time. Then we have the battles of the Burning Mill and Stone Hedge, which we will return to. It's after these events that the Greens hear of the Vale, White Harbor, and Winterfell siding with the Blacks. This all causes Otto to want to send envoys to the Triarchy to ask for ships to clear the Gullet, and there is a long delay, which leads to Otto being replaced by Criston Cole. After Criston Cole becomes Hand, he organizes the Cargyle assassination attempt, which doesn't give us any clues on the passage of time, but then we get the Battle of Rook's Rest, and it's right after the Battle of Rook's Rest that we get an update on the forces of the Vale, White Harbor, and Winterfell. They're gathering. And it's also just after Rook's Rest that Jace organizes the sowing of the dragon seeds in the waning days of 129. Now, I want to show how this actually plays out on the field. Daemon takes Harrenhal, probably in March, possibly April, and then we have the Battle of the Burning Mill and Stone Hedge. In this battle, essentially the Blackwoods start raiding Bracken lands, luring the Brackens out, only for Daemon to take Stone Hedge from behind with the help of the Derrys, Roots, Pipers, and Freys. It's that last house that's interesting, the Freys. From all the way up at the Twins, they made it all the way down to Harrenhal, and then up to Stone Hedge. Now, the Riverlanders are said to be slow to move, though the Freys are listed as the first to throw in for Rhaenyra. We have a reversal here, with the Freys being the most honorable. Certainly if the Frey forces made it, the Vale forces could have, though maybe they were waiting on those dragons, or they wanted to gather at the Gates of the Moon first before moving in altogether. Whatever the case, based on the distance, it shouldn't have taken the Freys more than a few weeks to cover the distance mounted, maybe twice as long on foot. However, the battles couldn't have happened too late, as people are still declaring for the Blacks and the Greens after the battles, and the Greens hear about the Vale, White Harbor, and Winterfell after the battles. Granted, some of these lords may have been waiting on the results of Daemon's Riverland campaign, but certainly not all of them, especially White Harbor and Winterfell. They declared with written agreements, it would be hard for them to go back on them and claim they were suddenly for the Greens. So based on House Frey's travel time and the fact that some houses are still declaring, Burning Mill and Stone Hedge shouldn't be too long after Daemon conquers Harrenhal. Probably a month, at most 2. That places the event somewhere between April and June of 129. So then, in reaction to the Burning Mill, Stone Hedge, and the declarations of the Vale, White Harbor, and Winterfell, Otto wants to clear the Gullet, so he sends some envoys to the Triarchy, and they are massively delayed. Now these envoys could certainly take a very long time. Because the Gullet is closed, the envoys would have to travel down to Storm's End, and then grab a ship over to Essos, and then they're delayed there because the Triarchy's council isn't even convened. This event could easily take months, and in fact, Aegon in story is massively upset with how long it takes. And so he replaces Otto with Criston Cole, and Criston Cole wants to do the Battle of Rook's Rest. Now, the Battle of Rook's Rest finishes near the end of the year, somewhat at least, as the sowing of the dragon seeds takes place in reaction to it. The sowing of the dragon seeds is said to take place in the waning days of the year, near Jace's birthday, which is also in the waning days of the year. Now, Rook's Rest should happen pretty fast as battles go, as they surprise Duskendale first before marching on Rook's Rest. Distance-wise, we are looking at a couple weeks riding, a month on foot. In this battle, Rhaenys and Meleys cross over from Dragonstone to join the fight, and they are ambushed by Aegon and Sunfire, and Aemond and Vhagar. Rhaenys and Meleys are killed, while Aegon and Sunfire are severely injured. So working back from the sowing of the dragon seeds, we can estimate when Rook's Rest begins. Assuming the sowing takes place in December, the march from King's Landing should begin in November, or maybe as early as October, with the battle happening somewhere between the end of October and the beginning of December. Keep in mind, after the battle, Aegon doesn't get out of bed for the rest of the year. In fact, he seems to be bedridden at least a month into the year 130, so you have to ask yourself what's a reasonable amount of time for a burned person with a broken hip to be bedridden? A month? 2 months? 3 months? Having the battle at the beginning of December would have him bedridden for 2 months. November? 3 months. Anyway, it's right after Rook's Rest that we get an update on Winterfell, White Harbor, and the Eyrie. They are gathering forces. And this is pretty rich as the agreements were struck at the end of March or in April of 129. Again, perhaps the Eyrie has an excuse as they haven't gotten their riders, but with Winterfell and White Harbor, there were marriage pacts. One was the Pact of Ice and Fire. March and April pass with no movement. The Freys make it down for the Battle of Stonehenge. Otto sends an envoy all the way to Essos, and he waits. June passes, July passes, August passes, September passes. Criston Cole marches up to Rook's Rest and then makes it back to King's Landing to hear about the gathering. It has been somewhere between 6 and 8 months, and yet Rhaenyra's allies have not moved. One could maybe expect a month to call the arms, perhaps 2, but 6 months? In fact, things don't really get moving until well into the year 130. You see, on January 5th, 130, there is the Battle of the Gullet. Those ships that Otto asked for from the notoriously slow and bureaucratic Triarchy finally arrive, meaning they acted quicker than the Eyrie, White Harbor, or Winterfell. Anyway, during this massive sea battle, Jace and his dragon are killed, Rhaenyra's son Viserys goes missing, and Aegon III's dragon Stormcloud is killed. And then we are specifically told that a fortnight later, that is, January 19th, a different battle, the Battle of the Honeywine, takes place. In this battle, the Green's Hightower forces are surrounded by House Rowan, House Caswell, House Beesbury, House Costain, and House Tarly, but then Daeron comes forth from Oldtown riding Tessarion, and the tide turns in the battle. Weirdly, not much is written about this battle, despite it involving over 5,000 Hightower men and 5,000 Rowan men. The battle was a big deal, and when news of this battle got back to King's Landing, Aemond and Criston Cole are emboldened by it and decide they want to march on Harrenhal. Now, we aren't really sure how long this news takes to get to them, probably a couple days, but Aemond and Criston Cole leave within a fortnight. So we're looking at a march leaving around February 3rd. And we are specifically told how long the march takes. 19 days. So Criston Cole makes it to Harrenhal around the 22nd, Aemond the following day. And this is all well and good as, at some point during this march, likely when the forces are well away from King's Landing, Rhaenyra attacks King's Landing and conquers it. Now at this point, we are in February of the year 130, and Rhaenyra's relationship with the Vale in the north has changed a bit. First off, around the time of the sowing of the dragon seeds, that is December of 129, Rhaena and Joffrey are sent to the Vale to fulfill Jace's promise of providing them dragon riders. Now the Vale has no excuse for withholding forces. Additionally, Joffrey Velaryon is now heir to the Iron Throne, so Rhaenyra's alliance with White Harbor should really be stronger. That said, Jace's Pact of Ice and Fire is now a bit useless as he's dead and unable to produce a daughter for Cregan Stark's son to marry. Now, around the time that Rhaenyra takes King's Landing, we do have some northern forces finally arrive south of the Neck. We're not sure where exactly in the north they're from, but Roderick Dustin is leading the Winter Wolves, a group of 2,000 mounted, and they arrive at the Twins, about 11 months after Jace sealed their alliance. As they're mounted, we know they left relatively recently. It should take about a month to ride from Winterfell to the Twins. And so we don't actually know if these Winter Wolves know that Jace is dead. Jace dies at the beginning of January. They arrive at the Twins sometime in February. Now, if the arrival of the Winter Wolves seems like an honorable fulfillment of the Pact of Ice and Fire, one isn't really looking at it right. First of all, there's only 2,000 of them. That's about 1/10 the size of Robb Stark's host during the War of the Five Kings. And later on in the war, Cregan Stark admits that he has 10,000 Northmen at home that he can send. Additionally, the Winter Wolves are old men, and Cregan admits that his other forces are younger and fiercer. At the end of the day, the Winter Wolves are a paltry sum and inferior, clearly sent out to die because they are expendable. Grizzled graybeards in old mail. In fact, Jon tells us how old men are treated in the north. When the snows fall and food grows scarce, the young must travel to the winter towns or take service at one castle or the other. The old men gather up what strength remains in them and announce that they are going hunting. Some are found come spring, more are never seen again. Later on, Roderick Dustin even highlights this by saying, "That's why we come. Winter is here. Time for us to go. No better way to die than sword in hand." And so the Winter Wolves do seem to quickly get down from the Twins to the God's Eye to participate in the Battle by the Lakeshore, or Fish Feed, which takes place shortly after Aemond and Criston Cole take Harrenhal and Rhaenyra takes King's Landing. This is sometime either at the end of February or in March. And so what about White Harbor and the Vale? Well, despite the Winter Wolves coming down to die because of winter, winter actually hasn't arrived yet. That happens on Maiden's Day. And that is by coincidence when White Harbor and Vale forces finally come to King's Landing by ship. The Vale forces actually miss their opportunity to go by land as snows close the passes in the Mountains of the Moon. Waiting so long will do that. So when exactly is the first day of winter? When is Maiden's Day? Well, we don't know for sure, but we know it comes before the battle over the God's Eye, which is May 22nd, 130. That's the battle where Aemond and Daemon both die. And we know that before this battle, Daemon waits at Harrenhal for 14 days. So he arrives on May 8th. And there's supposedly a letter ordering the death of Nettles on the day before, May 7th. And this letter, whoever the author is reacting to the betrayal at Tumbleton. And so the first Battle of Tumbleton is happening a few days before this, so maybe around May 4th. Now, on the other side of the event, we know that Maiden's Day takes place after Green forces have taken Bitterbridge and Longtable. Considering the fact that Green forces are at the Honeywine in mid-January, distance-wise, it would take at least until March to make it to Longtable, and Bitterbridge after that. They are mostly on foot. And so this places Maiden's Day, the first day of winter, which happens between Bitterbridge and First Tumbleton, pretty solidly in April of 130. Which means that White Harbor and Vale forces probably boarded ships about a month before this. And so, all in all, we're looking at a full year between when Jace treated with the Vale in White Harbor and when they finally committed their forces to action. And again, we need to ask ourselves, how many forces were actually sent? After all, the Winter Wolves were only 2,000 old men. How many people did White Harbor and the Vale actually send? It's said that fleets brought men to King's Landing, but a fleet can be as low as 3 ships. Because when we look at how many men actually made it to King's Landing, the numbers seem to be very low. So, first of all, we never hear about any Vale forces other than a single knight named Willem Royce being in King's Landing. Nor do we hear about them in any other battles. We know about one knight, no one else. Now, obviously, it doesn't make sense to have fleets send one knight, though the passage is a bit ambiguous and fleets might only apply to the White Harbor men. Still, whatever the meaning, it sounds like the number of people that came from the Vale was insignificant. After all, they're completely forgotten about, so it's a number that probably is less than 100. And much later in the war, Jane Eyre mobilizes 10,000 men. She was clearly holding back forces. As for White Harbor, it seems probable that they sent 200 knights, though one could argue that the number could be as high as 400. You see two Manderly brothers, Medric and Torrin, come down to command their forces. Medric is commanding 100 knights, and although we don't know the number that Torrin is leading, we do hear that he loses a quarter of his men, and it's considered a light loss compared to Laurent Marbrand, who loses 84 of 100 knights. The comparison to Marbrand implies 100 as well, not to mention it makes sense that he would have the same amount of his brother, but one could argue that Torrin had, say, 300 men, making his loss of a quarter, 75, light compared to Marbrand's 84. All in all, it looks like White Harbor sent somewhere between 200 and 400 men. It is a very small amount in the grand scheme of things, and especially so considering that Manderly's daughter is betrothed to the heir to the Iron Throne. Now one may say, who cares? Would a few hundred or a few thousand more men really make a difference? And the answer is, yes, absolutely. You see, what brings down Rhaenyra in the end was not green forces, but the Shepherd's rioters. Rioters in King's Landing are the downfall of Rhaenyra's reign, and they kill a number of dragons, including Rhaenyra's dragon Syrax and Joffrey's dragon Tyraxes. And of course, Joffrey dies during the riot, which breaks Rhaenyra psychologically. And the reason the rioters are able to cause so much chaos is that there's not enough gold cloaks in the city. There were 10,000 rioters and only 500 gold cloaks to face them. In fact, later we even hear of gold cloaks defecting. In this situation, an additional 1,000 men, maybe even a few hundred, could have made all the difference. Whatever the case, Rhaenyra is forced to flee King's Landing, heads to Duskendale and then Dragonstone, and is then killed. Aegon secretly retook the island and feeds Rhaenyra to his dragon. Now, regarding the timing of all of this, it's repeatedly said that Rhaenyra ruled half a year, though that would put her flight from King's Landing in August. As she dies in October 22nd to be exact, the half-year figure seems to be rounding down a bit. And this is because after Rhaenyra's flight, there is a Moon of the Three Kings. During this time, three kings, the Shepherd, Tristan Truefire, and Gaemon Palehair, rule King's Landing for what is said to be a little over a month. Yet this is difficult to square as the Greens don't take King's Landing until December. We hear of Sunfire dying on December 9th, with Boros Baratheon trying to take King's Landing at the same time. Envoys go to Driftmark and back, Tristan Truefire is captured, Gaemon Palehair the next day, and the Shepherd the day after that. So we can say the Moon of the Three Kings ends and King's Landing is retaken around the middle of the month. This means you need about 2 moons just to get back to Rhaenyra's death, so her flight shouldn't be too much earlier than her death. The beginning of October? The end of September, maybe? Regardless, it's during Rhaenyra's stay at Duskendale that she communicates with the North and the Vale one last time. They promise forces again, though not for a while, as the North is vast. That's right, it's now a year and a half since the Pact of Ice and Fire, and Cregan Stark is speaking of just beginning to gather his forces together. Meanwhile, Jane Eyre tells Rhaenyra to send ships to the Vale, even though there were already ships there before. Now, despite Rhaenyra dying, her second call to arms does get answered, though again, it takes a long time. Keep in mind, Rhaenyra's request takes place before her death in October of 130. Then Aegon retakes King's Landing a couple months later, and then launches a campaign against Rosby, Stokeworth, and Duskendale in the new year. It's after this campaign is finished that we hear about Northern forces gathering. It's been a good 3 months at least, but they're not the ones to first take action. Fearful that they'll have the same fate as Rosby, Stokeworth, and Duskendale, the Riverlanders, led by House Tully, rally, march on King's Landing, and participate in the Battle of the King's Road. Shortly after, Aegon is murdered, and the Riverlanders are welcomed into King's Landing. And this Battle of the King's Road seems to take place in March of 131, and the reason for this is that Aegon is said to rule 2 years, which would be March, and the fact that Elmo Tully is the one that rallies the Riverlanders, but he's lord only 49 days before dying, so the Battle of the King's Road can't take place too long after reacting to Rosby, Stokeworth, and Duskendale. But this is the rather suspicious part. The Starks, after receiving a request for forces, don't participate in the Battle of the King's Road. No, they are a few days behind. That's right, after 6 months, they're only a few days behind. Now yes, a trip from Winterfell to King's Landing could take as long as 4 months with an army on foot. We actually don't know if the Starks are mounted or not, but after so long it's quite a coincidence that they missed the battle by only a few days. It's rather apparent that the Starks purposely didn't join the fight. Additionally, after the Tullys win, the Vale forces finally set sail and quickly take Duskendale and Maidenpool. They are an even more suspicious lot as it shouldn't take 6 months to secure ships. Regardless, it's the Tullys and the Riverlanders that King's Landing yields to, until the Northmen show up a fortnight later to take control of King's Landing during the Hour of the Wolf. During this incident, Cregan Stark claims the North remembers, by showing up 2 years after the Pact of Ice and Fire, at such an opportune time to take control of King's Landing. Even in story, the characters call them late coming, perhaps a parallel to the phrase during Robert's Rebellion. All in all, throughout the Dance of the Dragons, the North and Vale collectively gave fewer than 2,500 men to fight, and they were mostly old. And that was after securing 2 Targaryen marriages from Rhaenyra and a Targaryen ward. The Riverlanders and Reachers, meanwhile, came readily and asked for nothing. And in the end, those Northmen came in, married those Riverland widows, and took their lands. Now, it may be that this was Cregan Stark's goal the whole time, to find lands for his men as winter fell. We are told that plunder and population control were their motives. Or perhaps he simply wanted to conquer everything. Cregan does say that he wants to continue on until he takes out every green. With all his foes conquered, he would be in a position to rule the whole kingdom. If he did crave power, his plans are thwarted by Jane Eyre and other late-arriving lords. It is said that Cregan Stark was often at odds with the newly arriving lords, and slowly his power slipped away. Of course, there's always the possibility that there was something more sinister going on, a conspiracy of some sort. It's difficult to say, and would be a topic for a whole nother video. For now, we must simply settle on the fact that the North and the Vale, for whatever reasons, had no honor during the Dance of the Dragons, promised to fight for Rhaenyra, but instead did next to nothing for a period of time that is close to the length of time that the entire A Song of Ice and Fire takes place in. They let Rhaenyra and her children die. And that's all for now. I'm probably wrong about half of this, but thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.